The foundation year program is what we call in some places a great books program. And I know that's not something familiar to a lot of people here in the United Kingdom, although those in Canada will be more familiar with it. But that is a great books program across the course of a year, introduces people to a selection of the most important pieces of literature across Western civilization. And so it's in light of this that tonight we begin with the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a 4,000-year-old poem considered by scholars to be the first great work of literature in the Western world. So here to lead us in a discussion of the Epic of Gilgamesh is Dr. Carmen Palmer of the University of Toronto. This is a woman who spends her academic life reading and analyzing ancient literature, more particularly what we commonly call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. Tonight, however, her attention will be turned to helping us fit the Epic of Gilgamesh into an ancient context we often don't consider. And in light of that, I'm just going to ask David to bring on Dr. Palmer. Before he does, I'll explain that because she wasn't able to be with us live tonight, we've pre-recorded the interview, something we did just last night. And after the interview takes place, we'll have a chance then to discuss things in our current forum. So David, if you would please set the video going with Dr. Palmer's interview.
We should say, we apologize that it had to be recorded. We hope that 95% of our lectures will be live with the speaker. So don't be disappointed that this is recorded and Carmen won't be here to answer questions. But here we go.
Welcome, Dr. Carmen Palmer, with us to talk about the Gilgamesh epic. I will hand over first to Father David Harris to get us started with some questions for you.
First of all, Dr. Palmer, lovely that you could join us all the way from Toronto.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Just so you can rub it in, what's the weather like there in Toronto?
Well, actually, this is not a good moment to rub it in because we're having a gray day, very humid, and actually looks like it's going to rain. But we have been having splendid weather thus far in the 30s Celsius, which is pretty common. How about you? Gray?
Yeah, nobody lives in England for the weather.
No.
No. So I want to thank you, first of all. Sorry?
But for the lush foliage, yes.
That's true, actually. Now, getting right to the Epic of Gilgamesh, I, first of all, want to thank you that I actually was forced to read the text. And I think I probably represent 99% of people out there that, why would you read a 5,000-year-old story? But once you do, it just comes alive. It was just incredible. The themes, so my task in the first 15 minutes is about the kind of cultural background to these texts, because we've got, texts from Greece a little bit later. We have even a little bit earlier, Egypt. What are the themes? Like, I couldn't believe how it was in the themes that animate people's lives now. But my question to you is, what are the themes of this ancient literature that we're looking at? What was the sort of cultural thing that was happening that made them emerge?
Yeah, it is a really wonderful epic. And what you say is accurate, that it really endures the test of time because the things that it raises are still so prevalent now, right? And so we do see that it's a kind of a mythic narrative where, in a way, it's sharing kind of a notion of shared memory that draws on what we would call ideologies, or in other words, explanations of why things are the way they are, or how it is that things came to be the way that they are. So in particular, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, we see interest in mortality, and why is it that humans are mortal, and in what ways are humans separate from the divine? Humans are separate from gods. But we also see a lot of what's really going on in culture in the epic too. Right? So for example, we observe that Gilgamesh is a king, so we see that there are political structures in place. The manner of his kingship is also quite interesting, which we can get into, but we also notice that there are themes of agriculture. You know, we read about drinking beer and eating bread. So we know that there is this kind of activity going on. But in particular, really a question of how do you define humanity as something separate from the divine and also something separate from other animals within creation, but also what is the nature of why are humans not divine, as an example?
So what we're at the same time, because Father James is going to deal with the Gilgamesh in particular.
Mm-hmm.
What were the stuff? Was there a difference between what was going on in the Mesopotamian scene and what was going on in the Greek scene and what was going on in the Egyptian scene? Were there common themes?
Well, certainly these ideas of mortality and also the divine, while the outcomes might be different, there are these kind of similarities across the board as well. But also, I think what you raise is a question about literacy in general and what is happening among the common populace. So one of the reasons we see Gilgamesh as an epic written down was so that it could be rated, given as some kind of a performance, right? Like a bard reciting this for people to watch. So something that would be common was that actually, you know, if we consider 5% of individuals to be literate or to be able to write, really you'd observe this text as kind of episodic, and that it's done in a way that can function as a bit like an aide-memoire, right? So that this idea of there's a body of literature, but it needs to find a way of being distributed among wide populations. That would be something common as well.
And what, from a literary standpoint, what's the quality of the literature in the Epic of Gilgamesh compared to, like for instance, in the New Testament, in the Greek, the Book of Revelation is just terrible Greek compared to the Greek of St. John's Gospel. Is it actually, do these ancient texts actually possess a kind of literary quality to them, or are they kind of
like
stories?
A literary finesse.
Oh,
yeah.
Really?
I mean, that's an interesting question. Certainly, right, it's written in Akkadian, which is a kind of cuneiform script. So this is a Semitic language, and we do see that scribes are trying to basically mimic and copy the same text over and over. But we do also see some creativity at play, right? That the scribes do seem to alter the text with time, right? The narrative does change over time from 5 poems into these 12 texts that are a much more epic. So we do see, again, a similar process of what I would call scribal redaction, scribal writing. So there's, on one hand, a desire to keep things stable and the same. On the other hand, there is also a desire to, you know, for scribe to practice a little bit of their own ingenuity as well.
One thing that really struck me, oh geez, if I could find in my text. Humbaba. Mm-hmm. Remember Humbaba? So Humbaba, in my little bit of research,
guardian of the cedar forest, yeah.
Yeah, he seems to be more of a Syrian or an Anatolian god. So in the modern kind of vision of things, we have the Egyptian mythology, we have Mesopotamian mythology, we have Greek mythology. Presumably we have like what's things going on in the Far East. What struck me about all of a sudden Humbaba showing up was, is there actually kind of an intertwining of the mythologies? So that people who in the Mesopotamia are telling stories, and when they tell stories about way over there in Greece, they actually bring in the other mythologies.
I think that we can see some overlap between who these different divine characters are, right? Like in other Canaanite literature, we also see talk of Shamash, sun god, etc. So there is overlap between who these different deities are. Certainly there would be some overlap among culture, which is then what we'll also see taking place within the Hebrew Bible itself, right? But I wouldn't disagree that there could be some intra-cultural borrowing going on.
My final question before I hand it over to Father James. When you look at these texts, texts sort of emerge 5,000 years ago. Can you tell from them, because what I was amazed with was how sophisticated the morality was, the cosmology, the sense of the relation between the divine and the human, the activity of the individual human soul in the world. Like, can you tell from these texts how it emerged that all of a sudden 5,000 years ago, you have this thing emerge where humans are actually writing things down? Like, what was going on? Sorry, that's a big question.
I think that's a great question. And I think part of, if you break your question down into a few different parts, the kernel of, where does narratives come from, right? I think part of that simply comes back to this ideological question of wanting to ask, this is how I see the way things are, and how to come to be this way. It's really intriguing that some of these same questions are being asked, or, and how does the transmission happen that you do see the same line of thinking among different geographic milieus? So I think another part of, so on the one hand, the creative process, how does that get going? I think that's partly, will always remain the mystery of, the creative mind. But if we also think about textual transmission, right? How is it that texts become written down in the first place? Part of that is a transmission issue with regard to, why do you want to write this text down in order to remember it, right? Sometimes a text might be oral initially and is written down and expands due to that writing process, right? Because then the text can function a bit like an aide-memoire, right? That you can remember it and then work with the text. Other times a text may be written first, right? And then takes on a oral quality after that as the narrative becomes shared. So I think there's a number of different processes that are overlapping and at play. Just as we see with ancient laws being written down for the sake of archival purposes, such as the laws of Hammurabi, right? Also from within Mesopotamia, we see the desire to, name or give accolades to certain individuals, right? Such as Hammurabi himself. So I think this is behind some of the scribal process and the scribal imagination as well, wanting to lift up particular individuals who are important to that group.
Well, what would you say if I challenged you on the ideological drive behind the text?
Okay.
Well, just because when I read Gilgamesh, I didn't see any ideology at all. I saw kind of mixed up cosmology, right? There were no answers really. They were kind of just new questions raised every time you turned the page. It wasn't like whoever wrote it understood the answers to any questions. All they had when they were writing it, they just had questions.
Yes, and I think what you're observing is Carl van der Toorn would suggest that there's a bit of a mix of genres within this text as well. So I think part of what you're seeing, which is that, these answers remain sort of open. In a way, this could be because of certain wisdom concepts that are drawn in. I think we can insert suggestive, I don't think I would call them answers, but certain directions that the text suggests where we should look. For example, with regard to, you know, what is of humanity? How can we become wise? Would there be any purpose to doing so? And at the end of the day, can we rise to immortality ourselves? So I think the text does hint at certain outcomes, perhaps not as concretely as what we would see in other literature. It does have kind of more tidy, maybe moral is not the word I'm looking for, but yeah, conclusions drawn. This one is more open-ended, I agree, but I think it certainly points in definite directions.
Okay, as I hand this off to Father, thank you for that. As I hand this off to Father James, my my lead into Gilgamesh in particular is when I read the first chapter, all I could think of was Donald Trump.
Oh,
right. The kind of the hubris of the character hasn't changed at all in 5,000 years. James, hand it over to you.
Thank you for that. Good. What I want to drill down to then is more the specifics of the Gilgamesh epic itself. We've talked now with David about context and about how such literature might have emerged. But really, if we could go back to when this epic first takes on a written form, how would a person at the time, for example, have encountered it? Who would have encountered it? How would it have been encountered? In other words, you know, presumably it's not the kind of thing that, you know, the average family will have been recounting to each other around the hearth or anything like that. So what kind of audience would it have had?
This is a great question. I think that in general, again, if we look to the idea that very few were literate, then the actual, you know, text itself would have been looked at by very, very small percentage, you know, perhaps 5%. But that then I think it could actually reach, because of the fact that it was written down, could reach a wider audience. And I think due to the fact that we see this figure of Gilgamesh carry on straight through even into some of a Dead Sea Scroll. This name, the consonantal form actually appears in a text from the 1st or 2nd century BC. Not in this, you know, the name is being reused, again, rewritten in a very different way. But I think that actually this longevity suggests that it could have been widely narrated amongst a variety of audiences, you know, including the commoner, for example, as a kind of comedic piece and also as a kind of explanatory piece. So I think that the audience could have actually been fairly broad. I mean, of course, we don't really have evidence to know that kind of thing exactly, other than to, again, look at if this text carried on in written form for such a long period of time, then it seems natural to draw the conclusion that probably it was widely received, widely performed, and that this idea of a character named Gilgamesh actually did live within the imaginations of many individuals.
Thank you. You've mentioned, you just used the term character of Gilgamesh, and I suspect that people who listen to this at some later date will be wondering, if they haven't read the text in their mind, we're talking about this seemingly obscure thing. I mean, you're not going to go into a bookshop today and find a book that says, the epic of so-and-so, because we may even know what an epic is, but it's not a term that we, associate with a common story. Can you introduce us to Gilgamesh very briefly and just walk us through what a person would encounter if they were to pick up or go online and read a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh today? Yeah,
you're quite attuned to parsing the terminology I'm using, which is great, because I did say character. I think there is some question about, did Gilgamesh start off as an actual king of Uruk? Possibly, maybe. Certainly he became a kind of a legendary figure after that, right? And the protagonist of this epic. So kind of this adventure tale that does toss in some concepts of, you know, of wisdom. So we do meet Gilgamesh in the beginning, and just sort of in a thumbnail sketch, we encounter him, we learn that he's actually in part human and in part of the gods himself, which is quite interesting. And we'll observe that in a way, we see vestiges of this kind of notion of kingship in the Hebrew Bible, but also different. So I'm just segueing to that in advance. But we meet Gilgamesh himself, and we learn that there is a companion created him sort of in order to keep him occupied in Kudus. This character starts off as sort of being a wild man in a way who needs to become tamed. And these two characters meet and become friends, and they go off and perform a number of adventures. Well, they still get in trouble, right? In the end, they slay the guardian of the cedar forest, and they slay the bull of heaven. Subsequently, the gods decide that punishment really needs to be meted out for this. But they decide that Gilgamesh will get to survive, and in fact that it's Enkidu who will die. And so this is the halfway mark. And so we see this long narration of Enkidu being ill and Gilgamesh really grieving his loss. And so we expect that Enkidu eventually does die. And the rest of the narrative is this much more sort of somber, sober Gilgamesh who is now fearful of death himself, whereas in the beginning we see him, you know, saying to Enkidu, get out there and live life, because, you know, that's what it's for. Whereas after Enkidu's death, he becomes quite fearful of that process and tries to seek out immortality for himself, right? So his adventures carry on. He goes off to find Utnapishtim, who himself was given immortality because of the role he played in saving human or creatures during the flood. And the narrative subsequently ends sort of abruptly and non-abruptly, in that it's, I think this is what David was talking about. It's kind of a non-ending almost, where he doesn't achieve immortality. It just, you know, he kind of recognizes that he will be mortal, and all of the attempts that he made at achieving immortality ultimately kind of fall flat. And that is essentially the end.
Excellent. I'm interested also in the way it is written. So if I think about, you know, the stories that emerge in Genesis, for example, even though we can talk about authorship and, you know, different authorships, you know, across various stories and whatever, there's still, and maybe this is a bias that I bring to it when I'm reading it, but there's a coherence to the narrative, and where there is, where stories are knitted together, even where we might identify clear distinctions, they've somehow been woven for textual encounter. It seems to me, when I was looking at the Gilgamesh epic, it's not nearly so refined. And I'm wondering, can you say something about really what a person would encounter in terms of the text itself? I mean, there's no smooth once upon a time. There was a, you know, just simply you launch in. There are verses that seem repeated, but talking about the completion of an action, for example. The action is described, then the completion of the action. And there were times when I thought I was rereading the same verse, and yet, you know, I wasn't. It was actually furthering of the story. Yeah. Can you say a little bit more about that, perhaps?
I think this is actually a pretty common feature of observe. I mean, I think it's purposeful, and in part it could also be this, we're observing the seams of narratives having come together, right? And we do observe, I think when we read the Hebrew Bible, we in some ways have maybe, they become so natural that we don't really notice seams anymore. And I wonder to an extent if this is part of what's happening in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but also in part, I think, I absolutely know what you're talking about with all that repetition. You literally think, oh, I must have accidentally, you know, gone back and I'm reading the exact same thing over again, right? It's a bit lyrical, it's really repetitive. And I think that part of that bardic quality, right? Like the idea that it's something that you can memorize through this act of repetitions. In its own way, I actually think it does find quite a bit of cohesiveness. While it may not fit exactly in what contemporary standards we would want the beginning and the end and the middle part of any kind of a narrative to look like, I think that it actually, in terms of an ancient narrative, does actually do a pretty good job of following character through this adventure. Some details we're not really so sure about. And then these components where there is a lot of repetition, I think this is part of the process of, you know, thinking about who the audience will be and how the narrative will ultimately get shared, right? In other words, that it would be done in an oral fashion, most likely. You know, if you were to go to a museum and say, I want to find something that's written in cuneiform, I mean, this is a good question in terms of, you know, what does the literature look like? Because often things in Akkadian for archival purposes. So I think it's sort of a genre in process, right? You would actually then go and look, you know, what actually looks like something that there was on clay tablet. And if you wonder what does that mean, I look for a clay tablet that looks like a little bird has landed on it
Right.
and kind of jumped around a little bit, right? There are these little wedges. And so, and it's a writing style where it's consonantal. So each word is made up of 3 consonants, and those can represent, like, that's the ultimate meaning of the word, and it can be as a verb, as a noun. So there's quite a bit of fluidity as well in the language itself. So there is some, you know, maybe we're losing some of its poeticness simply through translation, but I would wonder, you know, biblical Hebrew is also thought, or classical Hebrew, to be, you know, a kind of poetic even in its prose content. So I think that we maybe lose a little bit of that sense in the English translations that might be there if we were reading it in Akkadian, for example.
That's really helpful. Thank you. It seems that we've triggered David because he has raised his metaphorical hand to say he would like to ask a further question. So I'll hand it over to him and invite him to ask what's on his mind.
Well, it struck me as so peculiar, and it might be a good transition to Lucy covering the particular relations with the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Hebrew Bible. What do you make of Enkidu,
yeah.
The fact that he's this, I found his transition so fascinating, that he was this wild man who's covered with hair, he lives with animals, and he has to make this transition from being a wild man to being, in a sense, domesticated. And the way this domestication takes place is through having sex with a harlot for 6 days and 7 nights. And somehow that somehow the feminine is kind of domesticating the masculine. Or what do you think is going on there? It's such a peculiar.
If I might say before you Carmen even answers that, it sort of reminded me, is it Genesis 6 and the sons of God and the giants? I mean, it's before the flood story in Genesis, and you get that curious encounter between semi-divine and very earthly, in a not dissimilar way, I thought.
Yeah, I think it's a great, I mean, I think this is one of the moments where you read the narrative and you think, what is going on? Seems like a strange segue, right? Without really much introduction. And I think it really only makes sense when we then look back on the macro picture, like on the narrative as a whole. And, you know, we see what's happening is that we're defining Gilgamesh as a human and defining how humans are different from gods. But by the same hand, we're also seeing how it is that humans are different from the rest of the creaturely world, right? This week-long, sexual encounter that Enkidu goes through, it's interesting that at the end of it, it's that, in terms of his scent, the animals don't want to be near him anymore, which is often, something that appears in hunting, right? You don't want the animal to smell your humans, right? So he's sort of become humanized in this way. And it's a way of, so it's like another add-on to differentiate, by the way, humans are not gods, but actually neither are humans. Humans are distinct from the other, from creatures of this world as well. But it's quite interesting. And I think it also might behoove to help us to also remember that temple calls and these kind of female characters were regarded as a honorific or like highly esteemed characters too, when we're trying to envision this through our contemporary lenses.
What do you make of it? Sorry, I'll hand this over to Lucy now, but Enkidu is not fully domesticated. First, he has to spend 6 days and 7 nights having sex with a prostitute. But even then, he's not fully domesticated. It's not until he drinks, what was it, 4?
He drinks beer and eats some bread. Yeah.
Yeah, and then finally, and what's really interesting is it says, when the harlot says to him, now you have wisdom.
Yeah.
Like what? Now he has wisdom.
I think right back in the beginning, when we first started talking about, what are some of the very things that are happening at this time in Mesopotamia and in the ancient Near East. And we discussed a little about agriculture and cultivation. And I would imagine that this idea of, now you are eating it and you are drinking beer, right? These are things that you don't, right? It's not just something consumed straight up from wild. It actually required some kind of a process to become beer, right? That required a certain knowledge, wisdom to do, right? To perform these, chemical transitions to bread and beer. And that this does sort of represent the thing that makes us human well, right? The actual cultivation and actual processing of food products subsequently.
Interesting, thank you.
Good. What I'll do then is shift the questioning along and invite Lucy to take us into new ground that's somewhat perhaps related to some of the issues that have just been raised.
Yeah, I will. Thank you. And before I do, though, I'd like to just pick up on that theme that we touched on of Enkidu's ascent from the bestial to the human. And I'm really curious as to why you think the author or authors chose to anchor this transition on this particular point in the narrative, because it seems as rather jarring, because if we consider the context of his relationship with Gilgamesh, he seems to ascend into the realm of platonic rather than erotic love. And so therefore it seems rather strange that this transition should take place and be facilitated by such a carnal act. Why do you think that is?
I think that's a great question. I think to a point, part of what may be happening is, again, the drawing together of different individual narratives that have tried to become, knit together in an overarching way. Certainly we do see, on the one hand, it's odd that it's sexual acts that have to be performed in order from Enkidu to become human. And then subsequently, he has this very close friendship with Gilgamesh. But I think in general, an overarching theme there is simply what are relationships among humans like in general as well, right? What is it like when we have familial relationships or romantic relationships? And I think, you know, again, if we think from the broadest level, simply the notion that humans need company is something that we can draw from this, this line within the narrative.
Okay, thank you. I won't labour that point any further, so I'll go on to the main question we had, which is, I think, really, really important to discuss. So, what are some of the thematic parallels and other points of contact between the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Hebrew Bible?
Well, actually, we can. This is a great segue right from your question about Enkidu, because of the points in the narrative that we didn't go into previously, but that would be a good place to discuss now. When Enkidu and Gilgamesh first meet, they actually wrestle. And then subsequently Gilgamesh prevails. And we see Enkidu, I don't know if I would call it a blessing, but in a way he sort of gives this speech that acknowledges Gilgamesh's power and, you know, sovereignty, and that he is someone who will prevail. And they kiss and go off and be friends. We do see an interesting similar thing that happens in Genesis 32. When Jacob, it's at another transitional moment where this kind of in hot water, he's about to encounter his brother, and overnight he has this bizarre wrestling match with a man, an Ish, that isn't really described beyond that. And they have this wrestling match, and again, Jacob prevails and actually does receive a blessing. And so again, his leadership and his role in the Abrahamic lineage is kind of destined and affirmed from that point onward. We do see this interesting similarity there in terms of wrestling and prevailing in time and transitional moment as sort of something that affirms an individual's leadership and their role in general. If we move on from there, we've also talked a bit about some themes that are also emerging in the epic, and to an extent how perhaps some of the open-endedness of the narrative seems to relate a bit in this way. Because if we are reading Gilgamesh in one hand and you were to read the book of Ecclesiastes in the other hand, you would see some similarities there in terms of what we call skeptical wisdom. So this is not the kind of wisdom like Proverbs where, you know, do this and good things will happen to you. Rather, this wisdom sort of implies, well, all mortals are going to end up in the same place. You know, we're all going to die. So in fact, actually seeking knowledge, seeking wealth, these things that are called vanities in Ecclesiastes aren't really, aren't really worth it. And instead you should just live to the fullest. And from our modern sensibilities, I mean, this sounds a little bit existentialist perhaps, but we do see this kind of wisdom theme arise in Gilgamesh as well, right? In the beginning, before Gilgamesh is fearful of death himself, there's a moment when he says something very similar to Enkidu, like, come on, let's go off and have an adventure, don't be afraid. We're gonna get this, caretaker of the cedar forest, let's go off and do it, right? So it's actually a similar idea, everything just wind. In other words, all humans are going to end up in the same place. So just carry on and live life. So that's an interesting similarity that we also see between these two, body of literature and composite text. We also see now, most people who've ever heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh within the context of the Hebrew Bible it's probably because they've heard about similarities between that flood narrative in Genesis 6-9 and then what we also read about in the Epic of Gilgamesh, when Gilgamesh wants to achieve immortality and he hears that he should go and talk to Utnapishtim, who himself achieved immortality. So he goes off and finds him, and Utnapishtim recounts how the gods are going to cause a flood. Utnapishtim was given some very specific specifications on how to build a boat, to put animals and creation inside of the boat, seal it up, close it up, that a flood ensues that lasts for a certain period of time due to a massive storm, that this storm abates and the waters abate. And both narratives we see, although different order, the protagonist sending out some kind of, a bird, either a raven or a dove, to see if the waters have abated enough that actual dry land is there. And it's really paralleling in many ways what we find in, and that what he's been instructed to do as well in Genesis 6-9. So this is a really strong case of, at least of parallelism, certainly some kind of common cultural theme that is being used in both cases. But even other smaller things too. Toward the end of the narrative, we see after Gilgamesh has spoken to Utnapishtim, Utnapishtim is granted his immortality because of all that he's done during the flood. But Utnapishtim basically says, if you go off and get this immortality youth plant, maybe that'll be your best shot. And so Gilgamesh gets it, but while he's off, cleansing himself, a serpent smells the plant and comes and takes it and slithers away. And of course, what does this remind us of? It's different, of course, but it possibly brings to mind the serpent that we encounter in Genesis 3, right? Who very craftily says to Eve, come on, this is a good tree. You should go and eat this fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And Eve looks at it and says, yeah, actually, it's good for food. It's nourishing. Let's do it. So we see kind of this character who is somehow involved on the perimeter there with regard to, notice that Eve does not eat from the tree of immortality, right? She eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. So in both cases, there's a serpent around. Humans are not granted immortality.
Wow, wonderful. Okay. And in that case then, there's really so much to pick up on there. What I really felt, I'll ask this first. Because there are so many thematic parallels between the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Hebrew creation narratives, does that undermine the veracity of what's in the Bible? Is it a good reason not to take any of it literally? How much of it should we take literally? Is it all simply to be read as poetry? I'd be curious to know what you think about this, because I know particularly in sort of secular circles, there's a tendency to point out these similarities. The implication very much being that whoever wrote the Hebrew Bible was just parroting ancient myths of the ancient world, whether they were Mesopotamian or from some other source. I'd be curious to know how you think the two square with one another.
Well, that's such a great question. And I think it's really at the heart of, back when people first were learning about this narrative of Gilgamesh with respect vis-a-vis the Bible and saw these overlaps. I think this was obviously it was a big concern. And quite scandalous in the beginning. And I think that, whether parroting or not, it's clear that there is some borrowing going on here. But I think that the text of the Hebrew Bible is still very valuable. It's simply that, you know, this is segueing a little bit toward some of the comments that I'll make later as well. But I think it's a great reminder as contemporary readers that our notions of what contemporary history should look like, right? That we think, well, I mean, now with all things out there, just fake news and whatnot, I mean, maybe even our contemporary notions of history, we also have to reconsider as well. But, you know, in general, when we say I'm going to read a history book, we make assumptions that there's going to be representative of this activity that really took place on this date and this time and in this way. Whereas when we're looking at these narratives in terms of etiology, in terms of texts that are trying to describe why things are the way they are, while in the beginning of this talk, I did mention that in a way they are describing shared memories, these notions of shared memory are based on different concepts of what history is. And so we just need to remember that our contemporary concepts of how we view history are not the same way that we want to approach and read ancient concepts of history. And it doesn't devalue the text in any way. It just highlights that the mindset of what is going on is different behind these explanations for, you know, something that would be deemed historical, but in ancient terms.
Thank you. That's a lovely answer. I'm going to have to sit and reflect on that a little bit. Okay.
Oh, maybe next week we'll have more time to talk about it.
Yes. I'm just wondering how we're going on for time, whether I have time to ask one more question or if I should hand over to Daniel.
It depends on how profound the question is.
Well, it's a short question. I don't know if it's particularly profound. Just to kind of rewind a little bit, when we were talking about the sort of parallels we can draw between the Epic of Gilgamesh and some of the wisdom literature that's found in the Hebrew Bible. One of the things that really struck me about this text is that even though there is obviously belief in gods or higher beings, there's the idea that immortality is theoretically possible. But it seems to be, for me, the most stark difference between the two would be the Epic of Gilgamesh really appears to be utterly devoid of the theological virtue of hope. And when I talk about the theological virtue of hope, of course, I mean to distinguish it from general hope, being the expectation or desire for something good. I'm talking obviously about the desire and expectation for union with God in the next life, and the belief that God will make that possible. I wonder whether or not you would agree with me and what your thoughts would be on that.
That's a really great comment. And I think it is true that perhaps the desired outcome of these two different texts is different, right? In the case of Gilgamesh, it doesn't seem that the overarching quest is to think about the afterlife per se, how one might become unified with the divine later on. Mm-hmm. The goal is different in the end. I think they're still both narrating for the sake of finding understanding, but yes, perhaps the questions that they're entering with are simply different.
Okay.
On that note, I'll jump in and thank Lucy for some excellent questions, and move it sideways though now to Dan, and ask him to carry the conversation on.
So to carry on from that, and I wanted just some broad comments on it initially. The next question is, what does knowing about the similarities between the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Holy Bible mean for the manner in which we interpret and understand Hebrew scripture?
Thank you, Dan. And, you know, I think this segues really nicely from some of Lucy's questions, because in that final question, when we were thinking about, you know, Lucy, I like how you said there seems like there's a possibility, or, you know, the theoretical possibility for immortality. Yes, and also by the same token, no, insofar as Gilgamesh himself is the king. And so one of these common themes that is also relational then when we look cross comparatively to the Hebrew Bible is the nature of the king himself. I mean, I say king simply because it is a king in the case. So, for example, in Gilgamesh, we see that he seems to be born part divine, part human. There's an idea that we do find in the Hebrew Bible in vestiges. For example, in Psalm 2, that a king may be adopted by the divine. And this is a common idea in the ancient Near East. But then at the end of the day, one of the real differences that we do notice in the Hebrew Bible then, though, is yes, the king is a representative of the Lord, of Adonai, of God, but the king is fully human, right? So that's why we see David, Solomon, etc., do very human kinds of foibles, right? And actions that are sometimes very terrible. And, you know, often as readers of the Hebrew Bible, then we think, why on earth would they include in the narrative these awful examples of, you know, humanity at its worst? But in a way, those examples also highlight for us that really at the end of the day, the thing that is making the narrative move forward in terms of the promise to the people is God's self, right? Is God as sovereign. It's God's activity that is allowing and enabling the narrative to move forward. And so that actually is an interesting point of comparison, because it highlights for us a key point that, you know, humans are not divine in the Hebrew Bible. And in fact, kings are not divine, especially. They are the representative of, you know, they are the human representative of God, but they themselves are very earthly creatures themselves. And they're not, you know, partly divine or adopted by the divine. So there's a point of differentiation. I would say another key point is something that we touched on earlier as well, which is simply this idea that when we look at the Hebrew Bible, in light of many of these similarities that we observed in the Epic of Gilgamesh, to remember that we're looking at the Hebrew Bible not through the lens of how we would want to read a contemporary history book, but how the ancients thought about history in a different way. And so we can't apply the same assumptions that we would when we read the text of the Hebrew Bible, of Hebrew scriptures.
And what can learning about, but firstly, what is it that they are, how is it that they are seeing history differently? And how does that change how we understand history in the Hebrew Bible?
Well, again, when I say history, I mean, so for example, if we look at the 1st century CE historian Josephus, he is called a history writer, and he's writing about events that happened, but he's certainly putting them through a particular apologetic, a certain lens. And while the composition of the Hebrew Bible happened, of course, you know, many centuries, 100 years prior to that, it's helpful to think about that analysis terms that the narrative is being recounted by particular individuals who are wanting to narrate something in a particular way. So it'll be from their own particular perspective. But also then, if we're trying to look at it as a history book, concepts of history are not the same insofar as there's no constraint that this event had to happen on this day at this time, right? That rather this idea of shared memory is built upon a different kind of construct that's not quite as linear, for example, as how we might imagine it to be.
Would you expand on that where you say not as linear? So as opposed to what? And
as opposed
what does that mean?
Well, simply as opposed to that concepts of history are not as concrete within the ancient world, that you can have a narrative where it can still be true, but not in the sense of, as contemporary thinkers, we think true has to mean that it holds value and that it could still be something that is legendary and that has happened, but not in the same sense of our contemporary notion. That means, you know, that for sure at this time, on this day, this kind of thing happened. This notion of truth is simply a little different.
So it's kind of like we see history in a more sort of, would you say, scientific sense, but they see history as a story that kind of gets the sense or puts across the sort of meaning or sense for example, for a community or for humanity.
I think that's a great
history.
way to describe it. Yeah, I think that's a great way to describe it. I mean, in some regards, certain scholars would describe certain ancient texts, such as legal documents, as a scientific treatise. But yes, that concept, I think, as you say, is different.
So, for example, with I know there's a common parallel drawn between Genesis 1 and the Babylonian creation myths. In some sense, would you say they're aiming at history, but not in the sense that we would say of history? They're not aiming at both of them are not aiming at history in the sense of trying to say this is what happened step by step, but rather this is what creation means.
Precisely. Yeah, exactly. They're trying to explain how it is that things came to be, right? If we look at the creation account in Genesis 1, right, we see what seems to be kind of a very priestly undertone, a real interest in terms of, you know, having Sabbath, having rest, and wanting to be able to find ways to explain what are these things that we do in life that are rituals, that are important, and that we want to continue, you know, that are important, want to be able to do, and to explain those through some kind of a theological lens. I think, as you said, that's a great way to describe it.
How would that relate to things like, so these days there's a lot of sort of, some people might call it sort of fundamentalism, or sort of that, you know, this is our religion. We never engage with those other texts from others. They're all wrong. How would this way of thinking about that you've talked about, and also the similarities between, for example, sort of these similarities of trying to get at human truth and divine truth, how would they change the way that we think about the Hebrew Bible in relation to other religions now?
Is your question more so relating to perhaps the end of the question? Are you asking around, you know, for example, just looking across different scriptural texts, or?
I think I'm trying to get more towards, it seems they're trying to engage in similar questions of
like,
the place
can
of
we
humanity,
look at other texts as well?
And where there are similar, not to say that they are entirely similar or anything like that, but where they are similar, So maybe another way of thinking about this is, are these stories that are being told, for example, the commonality of the deluge in the two, or the flood in the epic and the Bible, are they universal? Are they just universal stories that they're all kind of getting into? Are they Are they copying each other, or is it? What are they getting at? Is it just a coincidence that they kind of have a similar story, or is it that they are genuinely? This is there's a reason why they have these similar stories.
Yeah, I think what I've been getting at is that there is definite cultural overlap, that there is definite knowledge of some kind of a body of literature among these different groups. And so maybe a good way to answer this question would be to talk about the proximate other. Right. One of the reasons that these narratives are written in ways that try to differentiate as well, Jonathan Z. Smith has spoken about the proximate other, like that when communities are trying to forge their sense of identity and, you know, these shared memories that we've been talking about are concretized, that in fact, oftentimes it's your proximate other, the person closest to you, with whom you feel the most threatened and against whom you want to differentiate the most. And so I think we see this interesting push-pull then between using similar narratives, but also defining them in ways that are pertinent and apropos to one's own community. You know, sort of what Lucy was asking about, that these questions at the end of the day are sometimes getting at different questions, right? The ultimate goal of the narrative, you know, is to answer different questions, for example. But for contemporary readers, to touch on a little bit of what you were sort of getting at earlier, I mean, I would certainly encourage readers to read broadly and to not be, you know, fearful of reading another narrative that does seem to have some overlaps.
I don't want to take up too much time, but maybe just a couple more questions. So this is probably should have been an earlier question, but when historians first kind of discover the deluge narrative, when they first uncover these texts, what are the immediate sort of influences on biblical studies, particularly regarding those similarities between the texts?
Well, initially, I mean, it was seen as a bit scandalous to discover that possibly there was another society that was, you know, thinking through a similar lens, and, you know, broadening our scope of understanding with regard to, you know, what is a shared narrative, what is a shared concept of ancient history, but simply to come to terms with, actually, this is still very valuable and very meaningful to actually discover these overlaps amongst cultures within the ancient Near East.
Carmen, I'm going to bring all of this to a close. I think that this has been incredibly helpful. I also think that it leads very naturally into what it is we're going to discuss next week, and we're fortunate enough to know that you're the one that's going to be leading us then again as well. But can I just say, on behalf of all of us and on behalf of everybody who will be watching this, thank you very, very much for everything that you've had to say and caused us to think about this evening. I'll just put it to you that you may have one sort of final thought to leave us with as we sort of leave the Gilgamesh epic behind and move then towards Genesis and Exodus next week. You don't have to, but if there is something you'd like us to consider between now and then, I think we'd be very happy to hear it.
Oh, I would just like to say this has really been a wonderful conversation, and I'm really, I think we have opened up a lot of new areas for conversation as well. and questions that I think people will want to continue to think about for some time. And I think one of the things that we can continue to think about that's a nice overlap between this week and next is, again, this idea of compositional history and transmission of texts, and how do texts become knit together into their final form, right? That it is not necessarily written by one single author over, a quick period of time, but rather some of the diversity we find within texts is due to complex redaction history. So that's maybe one thing that I would put out there to keep in mind as you're working through this week and preparing for next week for our ongoing discussion.
Brilliant, thank you. Good, thank you. Thank you, David, for working that out. Can I be heard by everybody? Can I just see some nodding heads? Yes, excellent. Unfortunately, of course, with Carmen unable to join us in the flesh tonight, it means that scope for questions is going to be somewhat limited insofar as I'm certainly not an expert in the things that she was talking about. I think we'd be very happy, though, to field any thoughts that people have had in response to what Dr. Palmer has shared with us. And see where conversation goes. I'm aware that probably a lot of us have backsides that are now tired of being in one place for some time, but that's possibly the hazard of this sort of format. But I think that it's a very small price to pay for such excellent information and conversation. But if anybody has anything to add or ask, I think it would be we'd be very happy to hear it. Yes, Lewis, I'll just ask you to unmute.
Can you hear me?
We can.
This is, I think, broad enough that you might have good answers. I'm just curious whether you might say more about the relationship between truth and facticity, as it was sort of clear that, these ancient authors aren't aiming at the kind of facticity that we expect, but still hold to this as if it's true, I think, in the same way that we would in terms of think of the value of something as being, facticity as being truthful. So if you could sort of say more about the truth of these things and its relationship to facticity.
I'll jump in there actually and attempt a response in the first instance and just say that as she was speaking last night, I was reflecting on the history that I've spent my own academic career studying, and consider the fact that sort of history as we think of it today, what we might call empirical history, is something that is more associated with a later development in antiquity and then into late antiquity called, for example, chronicles. These are texts that simply list events according to who the emperor was or what the year of the Olympiad was, or the year of indiction, that is the taxation year. And they simply go through these lists. This happened, this is who did it, and it moves on. Over time, of course, this develops. We can see how somebody like Eusebius, the Christian historian of the 4th century, writes both a chronicle but also the great ecclesiastical history, which of course many, at least seminarians, are familiar with. But certainly as history moves forward in time, it takes on sort of different facets, and yet it never, especially for history within the faith communities, never loses its interest in that other truth. I don't know how we would describe it, but maybe call it transcendent truth or divine truth. You see it in, for example, when in Christian terms, in the lives of the saints. You hear of these legends. You know that in many ways, the narrative around this saint or that saint isn't going to be exactly true, not in an empirical sense that we would think of truth as being today, but it certainly conveys a meaning, and that meaning can be of profound importance to people of faith who are listening to the narrative in the first place. So I know that's not an exact answer to your question, but I would say that we certainly never lose, especially within the faith communities, our need for different approaches to history.
Thank you.
I think Michael has raised his hand, Brother James.
Yes. Okay, Michael. I'll just ask you to unmute.
Yeah, I think I've unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. As a feminist scholar, what I could see from the text is how patriarchy has been enforced even from ancient times. The fact that we saw the Gilgamesh, okay, I don't know his name now, and the one who came from the forest, they had to wrestle. And when we look at masculinity these days, men are meant to be fierce, fearsome, and always fighting over issues. And then we saw the way they portrayed the woman as a harlot who, like Eve in the Old Testament, was used to seduce the man. Though now, unlike Eve, this was with sex. And then we saw that even in some other aspects of the Bible, we saw how Lot's children also seduced their father through sex. And that's the kind of portrayal I'm seeing in the relationship between the harlot and the man he seduced from the forest. And the fact that even when he came, there was nothing much talked about women other than portraying women as people, humans that can be used to tempt men. I think that's one of the things I took away from there. That, to me, somehow, I don't think the Bible has been fair in the portrayal of women. That's my contribution.
Thank you, Michael. I mean, I found it fascinating. I mean, the question of the place of woman in the epic is a fascinating one. I did find it interesting that, as I said in the interview, that for Enkidu, it was only woman that could actually lead him to wisdom. And it is all kind of wrapped up in the fact that she's a harlot and the fact that they had sex for 6 days and 7 nights. But there is this sense that it is the feminine which actually is the voice which leads Enkidu to wisdom. So I think it's more than just using women as objects. I think that in the narrative they actually carry and Gilgamesh's mother, a divine a goddess. She's a terribly wise and powerful figure.
Oh, that's true.
But thank you, Michael. Any other questions out there? G.
I guess my question, so I didn't read it, but my question was about its, I guess, relationship to like nihilism and hope. So we talk about it doesn't have this like theological sense of hope, but do you think it's, I don't know, do you think that people of the time would think that it's just like you create your own meaning, or there is meaning to be got, but not sort of the kind of meaning we would think of, or I don't know.
John Moore, are you responding to this? You're on mute.
Right. Hello.
You look like Charlie Chaplin in,
well,
in one of those black and white.
Yeah. No, I think I would like to respond to that young man, if I may, because one of the things that I found very interesting about this evening, and I think particularly about Lucy from St. Giles's question, was, if you like, to make it short, is the search for meaning. And the search for meaning is very much as much alive in our own time, in our own lives, like this young man has just asked, as it was then. And I was just thinking about the story of the guy I can never pronounce, Gilgamesh, is that at the beginning, he's living in the future. He wants to create a future for himself. And then after the death of his close friend, he's living in the past. And then at the end, he comes to realizing that he should be living now. But throughout that, there's this kind of search for meaning. I'm sorry, I can't quite put this together. I've got so many notes here from the talk, but you could almost sorry, no, I think I'll stop there because I can't quite formulate my response, but perhaps I can come back to that another time.
I think Lucy's question to Carmen was possibly the most brilliant question that was asked in the interview about the question of hope. Because I think and what G perhaps is getting at, the resolution for me, and I'd be interested to hear what other people think, the idea of hope never really comes in until the Christian religion. There is no kind of firm idea. Hope isn't just wishful thinking. Hope is a vision of the end. And I think that what the Gilgamesh resolution is similar to the resolution in the book of Ecclesiastes, and that is it's kind of a conclusion of resignation. That it's, there is no hope. You're stuck. Your life, you're going to die. Your grandchildren and your great grandchildren won't even remember your name. So you're going to just disappear. Nobody's going to care. And so just make the best of it. And that is the resolution of Gilgamesh, and it's the resolution of Ecclesiastes, which is a very different resolution than what I think is the word of Scripture and the word of the gospel. Entirely different.
I guess like for the follow up to that, then, if we don't get this notion, like this strong notion of hope until, I guess, Christianity or Judaism or whatever, is there a notion that people are like grasping at, saying this is a thing that we can't get, or is it that it's a whole new paradigm shift that comes along, and they just wouldn't have thought in these terms? Like, we're just sort of anachronistically talking about hope in Gilgamesh, but actually I haven't thought like that at all.
Gee, you've sort of answered your own question, and I mean that in the best sense, by asking about the it being such a radical sort of paradigm shift that the terms don't even make sense in that context is in fact the answer. It's not that the way Father David just described it, there's a suggestion that what we see unfolding across the Epic of Gilgamesh is anti-hopeful. Hope, the way we understand it, is not a category. And I think that harkens back to the question that Father David asked when Dr. Palmer was speaking. And he said, I'd like to put a challenge to you then, because she had mentioned the word agenda. And he said, I didn't see an agenda. So what do you mean by that? And there is a sense in which it's simply, there might be an agenda in the epic, but the agenda is to explore sort of more questions that arise around why and how, more so than where and about and future. That just simply is not part of the subjective experience at such an early stage in the literature.
We just don't know what happens in 1,000 years' time.
Yeah, we
I'll jump for 2 seconds. So,
go ahead, Alex.
Sorry, I didn't interrupt you. I couldn't find the time to like cut myself through. I'd kind of entirely disagree with everything you've all just said, in like a very strong way. I think the myth arc clearly, there's sort of 2 points I'm going to make. One, I find it incredibly hilarious that we keep it inside the perceived story. So we actually know there's an additional tablet, and there's still like 37,000 of the tablets that have yet to have been translated. So there could be hundreds more pages to the myth arc, but we've just gone arbitrarily, or like not arbitrarily, we've created a meaning inside of what you guys are saying is a hopeless story. So I find that fascinating in of itself. But the second point is that clearly the meaning of the story is the wall he built, the place that he resides. That is his like future for him. That is the meaning. The meaning is the things we generate for ourselves as like that go beyond us, that are not just in, I can't think of anything more transient or more transcendental than the bricks you lay for the futures that exist, right? Like future children are what will ever only exist. So there's no need to think about anything else. That's why I think I agree with what Jan Moore was saying, that basically that like, you know, he's thinking about the now, and that's why the perceive, when I was reading around on this as well, was there's an idea that he lays his head at the foot of his wall, and that is where he writes his own epic. That's the sort of idea behind it, is that he wrote the epic, and it's him writing this story to say, hey, look, you may think life is hopeless, you may think that death is going to get us all, and it will, but you can build great things, and those great things can stand for what you stand for, or what you stood for. And the whole point of the huge transition is you see him as a philanderer, as a woman abuser at the very start, to ending as this man who goes, it's about something greater. It can't just be about the pleasures of the human. It's about the extension of how we extend ourselves through. So I just think you're entirely off base on saying that like there's no hope. That is hope. Hope is what we build for the futures that come ahead of us. It can't be. No.
This is where you're so wrong. I didn't say that there was no hope in Gilgamesh. There's no hope in the sense of what Christians mean by hope. What the hope is in Gilgamesh is resignation. It is a resigning of oneself to the simple tasks of life, and if there is hope, there's hope that there's meaning in that. Like the Gilgamesh at the end is like, just enjoy your bread, enjoy your beer, enjoy the garden, and maybe there's some meaning in that. Right, that's the resolution, and that's the resolution of Ecclesiastes. Just, but there's no what that's very different than hope in the sense of, you know, even immortality. They don't, you know, immortality. Do you get it? Well, then you just live forever. Is that really what we want, to live on this earth forever? There's a resignation that maybe that isn't what we actually want. So I don't think there's no hope. The hope is found in resignation.
Right, okay. So I still think there's nothing wrong with that. You're making it sound like, the idea of using the word resignation is a very poignant, like negative term, right? Resignation does not sound like something, you know, moral or something, I don't know what the right word would be, like empowering. It's a very weak notion to be resigned to life. I think that's completely the wrong way to take it, right? That all
if you believe that resignation is what the human moment is about, then it is the ultimate moment.
You keep using the word resignation. I don't think acceptance is resignation. I think it's two fundamentally different things, right? One of them is delusion, where you're putting yourself to something where that doesn't exist. You're saying there's something that will exist, and then there's something that does exist, and you're accepting that as it is. I think that there's a difference. I hate the word resignation. It's just such a was pejorative the word would be the right word? I don't know. I just disagree entirely.
Look, get a thesaurus and find a different word.
Sadly, I don't have one. I've got a bunch of books down here, but none of them are thesauruses.
No thesaurus.
I think on that very minor debate, although important one, we'll bring questions and comments to a close. It is now 9 o'clock, and I think this has been incredibly fruitful. I hope that all of you have both enjoyed it, but also will feel as if you'll go away with things to think about. Fortunately, we have Dr. Palmer with us again next week, and we will look forward to hearing from her then. We are working at making it possible for her to be with us live. That, of course, is complicated simply by the fact that she's based in Toronto, and the time difference it presents a difficulty. Having said so, I can see Lewis smiling in the background because he too is in Toronto and has overcome that challenge. We'll see what we can do. In the meantime, I look forward to, I know some of you have a tutorial tomorrow morning, and I will hopefully see some of you there. But in the meantime, those of you who do not, we will simply look forward to seeing all of you back here next week. I will urge you one more time to visit the Center for Applied Theology's website. It's simply appliedtheology.org.uk. And if you feel it's something of interest to you, to take out a membership. If the membership function is still not working, which I hope it will be, but if it is not, it is possible to simply make the small payment via the Just Giving button at the top of the site, and failing that, just hold on until the issue is sorted. But none of that is as important as what it is we've heard. Thank you all for being here. God bless you. We'll see you next week.